Hi, this is Chris at Clever Unicorn Games and the Unicorn Collective, back with another one of our interviews. Today I have Wes Woodbury, manager of Fundamental Games and designer of Legend of Novus and Die in the Dungeon. How are you doing today, Wes?
I'm doing fantastic, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So, what do you do when you're not designing or playing board games in your spare time?
I work about 50 hours a week right now with a big retail store. I'm in an office for there right now on a break, and then in the spare time, the family and I like to go hiking and just kind of hanging out, occasional movie or read a book, just casual stuff.
Yeah, you sent me that photograph of your family there hiking it, and that was beautiful. I mean, the mountain behind. Yeah, it looks like you live in a very beautiful part of the world.
Yeah, it takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours to drive to those mountains, but it's worth it every time. So we enjoy it. Usually we try that every couple of weeks in the warm time anyway. In the winter, maybe it's once a month.
What would you say is your favorite board game?
Um, yeah, I've heard you ask that question before, and it's so hard. I've got favorite board games in different genres. I mean, I like Castles of Burgundy for that really planning 4 stages ahead type of mentality. I enjoy the card drafting and deck building mechanics of Tyrants of the Underdark. And um, in terms of, I'm really deep into fantasy, and yet strangely, I don't have many of my own fantasy games because I don't have a group that I play with. But fantasy game that we've enjoyed the most as a family has been Clank, especially the Clank Legacy. That was really cool to go through.
Yeah, I've meaning to get because it was Jamie the other day when I did his interview said you need to play that game, and so I've ordered it. So I'm going to be giving that a go when it arrives.
Yeah, it's worth it. We had a lot of fun with it. So.
What genres or types of games inspire you to create games yourself?
Um, it's not necessarily the games that inspire me, but just the world of fantasy. So the books, the movies, the visuals, and the artwork behind it. That all keeps me going, and it's always fantasy for me. So I play all kinds of themes and genres that help influence kind of some of the mechanics I put in my game. But I'm truly inspired by fantasy.
What are some of your favorite fantasy books?
I've enjoyed the original 9 books by Ari Salvatore when he did the Legend of Dritz series. I enjoyed, of course, Lord of the Rings, the start of it all, and also enjoyed that first book by, I can't remember what it's called. It's The Wind, the Name of the Wind. I thought that was an interesting take on the fantasy genre by Patrick Rothfuss.
Nice. When coming up with a game, so when you've got it in your head that you want to make a game, where do you start with your game design process?
I start in my head quite a bit. So, like I said, I travel a lot, and anytime I'm driving, I just put ideas through my head, it's kind of like a washing machine. Will this work? Will this work? And I almost try to play out the game in my head and think of the cards and the mechanics before I ever put it on paper. And I probably go through hundreds of designs that way and just toss them up in my head. When I get something that I think works, that's when I start going into a prototype stage, both physically and digitally. I like to use Tabletop Simulator and put games together and see how they work before I create something concrete.
In your experience of getting a game, taking it from your head, putting it down on paper, prototyping, and then going all the way to market and kickstarting or publishing it, have you ever come against a hurdle or a barrier and hit it and thought, this is going to be trouble, and then you've overcome it? How did you overcome that hurdle?
The biggest barrier would have been with Legends of Novus going from a card game into an actual board game because the idea was not to have to do extra components and cards and boards. But then the game evolved to a state where I really did want to have all that stuff in the game. So I ended up putting that on the back burner and doing a card game first just to get used to what Kickstarter was. And then was developing Novus behind the scenes. So I bypassed that hurdle by creating a whole new game first and then finishing the other one after.
Have you ever played a game that you really didn't like? You don't have to name it, but what was it that made you think, this game isn't for me? Was it the theme or mechanic or what was it?
Yeah, it was a game that inspired Legends of Novus, actually, and it was a card game many people are probably fond of and has made millions of dollars. So me saying something bad about it's not going to hurt its reputation. But that's the game of Munchkin, and Munchkin was about building a fantasy character, but in such a take that menial, comical way that it just was completely out of my realm of fantasy. Like, but it did teach me that I could build a game that I wanted out of just cards or evolving from there. So Munchkin was the reason I built Legends of Novus.
Yeah, Munchkin. It's one of the earliest games that got me back into the hobby, and it's one of those games where it's it's a game where you can have a good game, where you can have a fun game of take that with your friends that takes about half an hour. The problem is that sometimes there's so much take that it can take 4 or 5 hours, and that's where it becomes a little bit tedious, if you know what I mean. However,
Yeah, and you can't really
there are some versions of it that balance it out. So there's some named, they've done like the themed versions from like TV shows and things. Like one that
yeah.
my son has is the Adventure Time version of Munchkin.
Okay.
And the way that works and the cards in there are more balanced than a normal game, so that it's generally only an hour or less, and it's nicely smoothed out, so it actually plays a lot better. So
Yeah.
so there is that. There are, because there's so many versions of Munchkin now.
Yeah. I mean, he's taken it. And Steve Jackson Games has done a wonderful job with creating a brand out of that and a license, and just it just keeps churning out funding for him. So good on them. Just not in my wheelhouse.
Just not for me.
Yeah.
Uh, why is it that you make games? What is it that drives you to make these games for people?
I've always wanted to be a creator of some aspect. When I was younger, I used to dive into art, and then I still sketch from time to time, but I could never invest enough time and the right energy into creating good artwork. And then I wanted to do writing, and I dabbled in writing and wrote half a book and never pursued that. But then when I learned about board games, I started creating them, and that's something I realized I can do art, concepts, I can do writing, I can do story, and I can do mechanics, and I can finish it. So it was the first major creative endeavor that I could actually do start to finish. And the great thing was anything that I couldn't do, I could hire somebody to do. Whereas with writing or with art, you can't just hire somebody to do art with you and sell it. You have to be the one that creates it and sells it. So board games help me be kind of that in-between person that creates a concept and gets other people to help me finish it.
How has what's happening in the world affected how you produce and design your games?
Strangely enough, COVID-19 has helped me in ways that it's probably hindered others. So I live in a small town, I have a family. Getting anywhere with any amount of people to play games to a high level requires at least an extra 3 to 4 hours of my time. So being now that everything has to be done digitally and people are relying on Facebook or Tabletopia or Discord even more, it's actually given me a bit more leverage in what I've already been trying to sell myself as anyway, which is a digital playtester and podcaster and discusser of all things games.
What is it that you're working on right now? Have you got anything new in the pipeline?
Yeah, I'm sure people have seen the ads already. We're about 3 weeks out from Die in the Dungeon launching on Kickstarter, but I've been working on the game since last March. So as Novus was kind of finishing its development stage and going into Kickstarter, I was already pre-planning the next game, and I wanted to be a different, kind of a lighter game with more humor to it. So I've been working on that one for quite some time, and I think that one will actually be more successful than Novus, even though the artwork and ideas behind Novus were a bit higher level than Die in the Dungeon.
Yeah, it still looks cool though. That's the thing. It's a completely different style to Novus, but the art is still very cool. I've been looking at that today, and yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
very interesting.
A lot of young artists from Italy and area really contributed some fantastic stuff there, and they've gone on to do other games. But I love the world that they helped me build for Novus, and
So you,
will always treasure it.
so
Yeah.
with Die in the Dungeon, have you got multiple artists have done different pieces for that?
No, with Die in the Dungeon, I decided to go with a single artist. I wanted to keep the theme as much as I could. So that's Tristan Rawson, and he's getting well known in the board game industry for some of his work. He does it all in a very tight sketch to vector art format, and just looks gorgeous, and really happy with what he's done with any concepts I've sent his way.
What piece of advice would you give to somebody thinking about giving a board game? What is the main thing you would say to them in their journey in board game design?
From the get-go, they have to decide how deep they want to go. So first of all, this is an expensive hobby. If you ever want to produce your own game, you have to be willing to risk If you want to make anything good, you probably have to be willing to risk at least $5,000 of your own money and not expecting to get a full return on it. Down the road, you might be able to, but you really got to think about that in the forefront. And then time. Time is a huge investment if you want to do the actual hiring an artist, publisher, manufacturing, distribution, Kickstarter, all that stuff. Huge time sink. So if you just want to design games and a publisher and don't worry about this aspect, if you've got an extra 2 to 3 hours a day or 10 to 12 hours a week, then you might be willing to dive into this aspect of it.
Brilliant. And again, that's something different that I think nobody's mentioned before, is the actual amount of money that it does cost to get in, because people don't realize that even if you're going through Kickstarter, you need to have at least, a basic of your artwork ready to show off on Kickstarter, and that obviously costs. Unless you're doing it yourself, then you have to pay an artist to do that. Which I think,
You've got to be able to probably have at least half your game, if not more, already done for art if you want it to even stand out at all on Kickstarter.
yeah, and that's the biggest outlay on most of these things at that point in the process. But that is great. Thank you for coming and talking to me today, Wes. That was brilliant.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. Always willing to share. And are you funding some games yourself? I heard you mention that earlier that you were doing a game.
No, I had a successful game there last year, and then I had, at the beginning of this year, I had another Kickstarter that fell on its face. So I have a good one and a bad one so far, so that's good. It's good experience anyway. No, I'm not really got anything that I'm pushing at the moment. Mostly just pushing this, pushing to get people to watch and see how designers work, so they can learn about it from your perspective, rather than normally they see the advertisements and things. It's nice to actually learn how designers go about making these games that these people are getting and taking home and playing. So this is what I'm doing at the moment. Plus, it's helping me not go insane being locked down in my house. So.
That's right. Well, I'm glad you're doing it. I was glad to be on the show, and I'll be watching the rest of your episodes. I haven't caught the Jamie one yet. That's the next on my radar. So congratulations on having such an honored guest on your show. He's always willing to help out new creators.
Yep. So thank you for coming and speaking to me, and I will be keeping in touch, whether you like it or not.
All right. Thanks again, Chris.